seen a sort of right-wing push on education that has also seemed to argue that resources don't matter so much, funding doesn't matter so much. And it comes out of a specific strain of economic thinking among some economists and some ideologues. I think what we've seen is that that doesn't work. It was embedded in Race to the Top. It was embedded in a lot of Arne Duncan's education policies, which turned out to be a complete flop. And he was very much on this corporate reform train, which basically argued that the free market system of competition was the way to improve schools. I like to call it corporate reform thinking that dominated both parties for quite some time. And there was the perception that there was less money to keep class sizes as small as possible, but there was also a determined effort on the part of a lot of powerful players to argue that class size doesn't matter, despite all the rigorous research that shows that it does. Instead, we should focus on improving test scores by rating teachers and schools on the basis of test scores, closing schools and firing teachers that didn't get good test scores, and expanding the charter sector.
We have seen our evaluation system get harder and harder and harder and harder and harder over the years. It's kind of like the frog in the boiling water, right? Because like when we came in, evaluation was completely different. It gets harder and harder every year. We're surviving in the hot water, but if you just drop somebody in it, like burnout is real.
One of the big things that is tied to us getting raises is our like employee expectations, our formals, our performance. But if you're a new teacher, you're obviously probably not going to perform your greatest. And I can say that being in my first 2 to 3 years, I wasn't performing at my greatest. And also I wasn't having my needs met because I was in survival mode. A big thing was my second year teaching. I made this vision for myself to be this like amazing teacher, amazing scholar of education. And I was that. Like, I was like, oh, you're really great for a first year teacher because of the way that you manage your class, the way that you do things, right? And it was all the things I didn't like: yelling, control. When someone came into my room wanting to make sure that my students knew, you better represent me, right? Because that's important, that ego side of things. And also I was stressed. I was burnt out. I was doing school. I was staying really late for work, arriving really early. It just was not sustainable. And I knew I really wanted to do this and I wanted to make this career path work.
A consistent drive among teachers is for evaluation to reflect high standards that we ourselves have some input on determining.
One thing that I am actually in the process of doing again right now that I find super meaningful, and I would love this to see more teachers do, is the National Board Teaching Certification process. Like, the National Board standards are created by other teachers, and then when you present your portfolio, the other teachers are grading this, whether or not they think it's good information. And the standards that they go by to evaluate their portfolios are also standards that are created by teachers. I was certified in 2013, so I'm in the recertification process, and just reading through what nationally teachers are thinking are good indicators of good teaching, and then reflecting on my process, like my progress over the past years, and then like moving forward, like what else should I be doing? It's super meaningful for me to be able to pick my own ways of growth.
One of the things that's happened ever since kind of the Reagan years in the United States is this idea that you can blame the teachers. And the way we've seen this in the last 20 years, since about the year 2000, is with a real emphasis on, first there was an emphasis on certification. You had to be highly qualified as part of a law called No Child Left Behind. That whole like highly qualified thing led to a lot of people like brushing up on credentials and stuff. But the people who wanted to blame someone saw these changes happening, saw people focusing on highly qualifying credentialing, and they weren't getting what they wanted. What they wanted was to be able to get rid of the bad teachers.
I think they're leaving because they're tired of being disrespected. Yeah, I think the overarching and overwhelming theme is just burnout. Folks are tired, they are exhausted, and the hits just keep coming. It comes from one thing to the next to the next. It's another deliverable, it's an observation, and it never stops. So I hear a lot of just exhaustion, frustration, and then I think the hardest part right now is confusion.
Starting around Obama, we had Race to the Top. And Race to the Top is another set of like education policy changes. But essentially, Race to the Top was the idea that we need to professionalize teacher evaluation. So again, it goes back to this idea that if we can use an evaluation system to separate the good teachers from the bad teachers, and then fire the bad teachers, then we can improve our schools, and that will be great for kids. They wanted to do a multi-measure evaluation, right? So they added in a lot of statistics. Your students' data, how they perform in your class on an assessment, is now part of your evaluation if you're a classroom teacher, as is observations, as is a list of behaviors called the professional expectations checklist, and as is a whole school measure. So basically, how well is your school doing overall? Every kid in the building, that becomes part of the individual teacher's evaluation as well.
When they were talking about this new rubric, I know that they were going off of a model that had already been created, and they were going to adapt it to Baltimore City, what the teachers here thought was appropriate. However, this is the big thing that blew my mind when it happened was when they started this process, what they were gathering information from teachers was like, how to recreate this thing that exhibits all these good behaviors so that over several years, teachers could become better at teaching if they were constantly asked to reflect on this rubric. And our question was always, well, as long as this thing that we're creating here isn't meant at all for a one stop into my classroom, look at all the behaviors that you can see and then leave, right? This is going to be a continuous progress, a work in progress, and not just a twice a year thing, open the conversation, close, open and close it. And that was a verbal from every person that was hosting these meetings that was trying to create the rubric. Every person said, absolutely, this will never be used to go into your classroom and evaluate a teacher based on like, in these 75 minutes, are you meeting all of these behaviors?
Because we, thought that this was going to be an overarching set of like progress goals, our conversations reflected that. And I distinctly remember a lot of moments in those conversations where people said the words checklist and drive-by, because we didn't want the experience of someone coming into the room going bop, 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 bop on a list of 50 indicators and then walking out.
Twice a year, you get observed and you get rated based on if you have evidence that you are exhibiting these over 50 things. And it is like an evidence-based rubric where you either see it or you don't.
We're taking already the hardest definition of teaching in the state and now saying, do it on a moment's notice. It's a setup. It's a setup.
The feds mandate that each state test every public school student in both reading and math every year in grades 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and once in high school, and that they test every student at least once in science in elementary, middle, and high school. That's 17 total tests during a career. And that they use those results in large part to rank schools. In many cases, states give out grades, A, B, C, D, or F based on test scores. They could do it based on poverty just as well, and have systems for intervening, in theory helping, though the interventions are often not very helpful at schools that are consistently low performing. Standardized tests have been imposed for a variety of reasons, some of which out of concern, misguided concern, about the performance of public schools and the belief that if you raise the bar and yell jump higher and attach punishments to those who don't get over the bar, that you're magically going to improve learning and teaching. And there's also a nasty history of testing that comes out of eugenicist tradition, where some of the leaders of bringing standardized testing to the US in the 1920s and 30s were outright racists and anti-Semites. On top of that, districts who are concerned about where they're going to rank in the state system often impose their own tests. And this is where place exams like iReady have come into play historically. iReady is supposedly a way to alert teachers and school administrators to which kids are and are not ready for the state test. And now the manufacturers of tests like iReady, and have a product they call through-year assessment or benchmarking tests, where you're going to test kids 3 times in the year, once at the beginning, once at the beginning of the fall, once in midwinter, and then at the end, in order to keep tracking test scores. And test scores become school. The people who advocated No Child Left Behind, it was a bipartisan coalition where the co-sponsors included Ted Kennedy and President Bush. I mean, they made 2 promises. One, this system of tests and rewards and punishment would, one, improve overall educational quality and performance in the US and improve our international rankings. And the second important thing they said, it would narrow gaps between ethnic and racial groups in this country. The historic so-called achievement gap, really an opportunity gap between Black and brown and white kids. There's 20 years of data. It didn't work. The US was making more progress towards those goals in the decade before No Child Left Behind, and then in the 2 decades afterwards. Good researchers have concluded that the cause of these gaps is not primarily schooling. It's factors outside of school. And that the period when those gaps were closing, which was the 1990s, pre-No Child Left Behind, which wasn't until 2002, was when the US economy was improving in a way that gains were spread across the board, not just like recent gains went to the most wealthy. We're not closing gaps. We're leaving kids even further behind. And we're talking about Black and brown and new Asian immigrant and Native American kids in both big cities and on Native American reservations and in rural communities across the country are being left further behind by these policies, which are also driving good teachers out of the business. And who would want us to continue serving in a situation like that, where you're being judged by how well your kids fill in bubbles several times a year?
I'm able to just recognize the importance and like what it means to meet my students where they're at, right? And like do away, yes, the standards and this data is great, but also this is a person in front of me. And this child came in not knowing how to write their name or knowing how to hold a pencil. Am I going to penalize them for that? No, I'm going to work with them and meet them where they're at and pour into them in ways where they feel valued as a person, not because of what they know. And that has been very important for me in my work. I'm going to allow you the freedom to move, the freedom to like feel your emotions, the freedom to be like, you know what, I'm going to disengage for a little while because this is a lot. And then I'm going to come back when I feel like I'm ready. You know, from a young age, we are taught that what we produce and what we do equates to like our treatment. And I should be, as an educator, treated as a human because that's just the basic, not because of like, ooh, I turned my attendance in on time, or I stay really late after school, or my data is amazing, it's stellar. I should have my needs met as a classroom teacher just because this is the work that I do.
The same systems that dehumanize students are dehumanizing educators. And that's what she's given voice to is, in very particular ways, how she was being dehumanized by the expectations that various policies and practices were placing on her to carry out on her students. Humanizing work requires us to recognize how we're all interconnected and that the things that are happening to young people aren't just happening to them, they're happening to us as educators, but then also to their families.